Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of The Argument Clinic. My name is Martin, and my podcast partner is Lawrence.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lawrence.
We're going to have a super special guest on later in this episode. You'll get introduced to her. She's awesome. This is a podcast for everyone who wants to learn anything about Lincoln Douglas debate or just wants to have a good time, whether you're a grizzled veteran of the tournament scene or whether you're just a new competitor, or whether you're a coach, or whether you're just someone that likes hearing the pleasing sound of Lawrence's voice. This is a podcast for you. So before we go into the substance of our podcast, let's talk for just a bit about where we've been the last few weeks. So I personally was at Harvard this past weekend. I actually just got back from that tournament, and that was a winter wonderland. It wasn't run quite as bad as it has been in the past. In fact, it was a great tournament. Lawrence, what have you been up to these past few weeks?
I was at the Cal Berkeley tournament this last weekend. I had an amazing time there in the sunny land of California. I'm just kidding. It was actually raining the entire weekend, and most of us were just running around with jackets over our head trying to get out of the rain. And I also had the lovely experience of a red-eye flight where I left at 1 a.m. in the morning and got back at 8 a.m. on Monday, where I slept before going to class later that day. So, fun experience.
What's the utility of that?
Of what? The red-eye flight?
Yeah, if you're just gonna sleep anyway, as soon as you get in.
Well,
was it just cheaper?
I guess I didn't really complain because it wasn't my money for the flight, but
I see.
I wouldn't do it again.
All right, well, I think we both had a pretty good time these past few weeks. So, just some preliminary things. First things first, I'd like to mention our sponsor, Victory Briefs. Victory Briefs is a premier debate institution. They have a spectacular summer institute that you can even now sign up to work at. They have a great debate news page. They have a Facebook page that you can feel free to go on. It's really just a great place with great people. And Lawrence, would you like to say something about Victory Briefs?
Yeah, so we recently released the full first initial hire list for LD. Both Martin and myself, as well as our guest, are all working at Victory Briefs this year. So if you like to come meet us in person, let's go to Victory Briefs.
Yeah, definitely. And once again, you can feel free to like our Facebook page, which is at The Argument Clinic. Our Twitter, you can follow that. It's Argument Clinic. Our email, any questions that you have about the podcast should go to theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com. So feel free to hit us up on all of the relevant social media sites. We're on Stitcher as well as iTunes and everything about that. Okay, so with that out of the way, this is another scholarship episode. We kind of alluded to the topic of the podcast this week. The topic of the podcast is the upcoming topic. So the new resolution is out, as most of you know, for the March and April tournaments. And we'll get in this entire podcast will be what we think about the topic, kind of going into the general meaning of the topic, as well as some arguments that people make for and against on the topic. So we want to give you all a pretty good basis for research and for understanding going into tournaments on this next year. So a lot of very important tournaments are on the March-April topic, even though there aren't that many times that each individual person will debate the March-April topic. Tournaments like the state championship are often on the March-April resolution. At least I know that Florida's are. Are Oklahoma is the state tournament on this one?
Yeah, actually, March-April is probably one of the most important topics in Oklahoma because it's our topic for our NSDA national qualifiers, our regional qualifiers, and our state tournament. So the 3 post-season tournaments are all over this topic.
Awesome. Yeah. For us, it's all of those tournaments are on this topic, although in the past, sometimes NSDA qualifiers have been on something else. NSDA qualifiers have been on the January, February topic, but this year they're on March, April. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our special guest for the podcast, Kathy Wang. How are you doing?
Hiya, I'm pretty good. How are you?
I'm excellent. And how are you doing, Lawrence?
Better now that I've gotten some sleep to recover from that red-eye flight.
Well, I arrived from Harvard just recently. We're super happy to have Kathy on the podcast. Kathy, did you do debate in high school?
I did. I debated for 4 years in Lincoln Douglas for Stuyvesant High School in New York City.
Stuyvesant High School in New York. Awesome. Yeah, I know that they've been very successful this year, actually. So I think that a lot of people are familiar with Stuyvesant High School.
Mm. Yeah, we just had a pretty good showing at Harvard, actually. I just got back from that too.
Awesome. Were you judging? Were you coaching?
I was judging and helping out with the rest of Stuyvesant. I don't officially coach them. I actually coached people in California who actually weren't at Berkeley, but it was still a pretty great experience regardless.
Who do you coach at Berkeley?
They didn't go to Berkeley this year?
Not at Berkeley. Yeah, my bad.
Yeah, it wasn't at Berkeley this year because the wait list was ridiculous because Berkeley's a good tournament. But I actually coach a pretty great independent debater from a really small school.
Okay, awesome. So let's get into the actual topic. In this first section, we're going to be talking about what the topic means. Sort of before we get into arguments one way or the other on the topic, we're going to discuss the ways of looking at the resolution, which is in many ways almost as, if not more important, than making arguments in favor of the resolution. So what experience do you have, Kathy, on this topic? Researching it or coaching for it, etc.?
Well, I researched the topic pretty extensively. I taught at Victory Briefs in Philadelphia, actually, this past summer, and this was a topic they used for the camp.
Okay, and Lawrence, I assume this also applies to you?
Oh yeah, Kathy and I worked on this topic at camp for 2 whole weeks, and I'm also coaching a few Oklahoma debaters on this topic as well, so I've been doing some reading on it.
Yeah, so I did not work at a camp where this was the topic last summer, although I did just recently write a topic analysis for Victory Briefs on this topic, for the brief thing that they do. So I've done some research on the topic as well. So we feel in a pretty good position to assist you all in figuring out sort of what the resolution means. So everything that we're going to talk about in this segment is based off of the words in the resolution, and we're going to talk about the various phrases that are in the resolution and how you should think about those phrases. What are the importance that those phrases have, etc. So the resolution is, and it's important that you, even if you don't know all of the words, although we'll talk about them in depth, you get the general idea of the resolution. The resolution is resolved: the United States ought to guarantee the right to housing. So again, the United States ought to guarantee the right to housing. All right, so before we get into any of the specific words in the resolution, let's talk about the main idea or area of the resolution. Most of it centers around what some scholars in the literature have called the housing crisis. This doesn't refer to the 2008 event because authors have been using it for actually many years prior to that. And it's just the basic idea that the homelessness problem in the United States has reached a sort of epidemic proportions. The amount of people who are out of their homes because they've been pushed out of their homes or cannot afford a home, they've been evicted, or people that just, for some reason or another, cannot find shelter, has really escalated recently among some really vulnerable groups just in the past few decades. It's become a real problem, and a lot of authors are referring to it as a crisis. So there are a lot of specific groups that are affected that you may hear about on this resolution. So Lawrence, can you tell me, like, what are some of the groups that some of these articles on the resolution talk about when they're referencing groups that are affected primarily by homelessness or lack of shelter, stuff like that.
Yeah, so you can sort of Google a lot of these general statistics, but most of them will come to the conclusion that there's more than 1 to 2 million people currently experiencing homelessness each year, and that can be divided into a bunch of different subgroups. So one of those subgroups are actually people that work full time, but are unable to effectively pay for housing because of high housing costs, or because they were kicked out of their house and they can't find a new one. So they're actually working and still don't have jobs. Some of those people would include people who suffer from sort of mental illness, and as a result, they generally don't have employment and can't have houses. A lot of those are people who have been to prison and are now sort of banned from, or like not banned, but like a lot of people don't want to take them in, so they have a lot of trouble finding houses, and so it's and there's a lot of other different sort of subgroups. So, for example, the more impoverished you are, the more unlikely you are to have no house. So, there's a bunch of different subgroups.
Kathy, do you know of any maybe that Lawrence didn't mention?
Sure. I also think that the topic seems to question issues of migration and refugees as well. At least I think that was something I read a lot about in the literature. People who come to areas like the United States can't necessarily settle down immediately, and so they have a hard time finding like the ability to have a steady income that would support housing as well.
That's a good point. I'd never thought about that. That's very interesting. I'll definitely look into that later. So the really important thing to think about going into debating this resolution is trying to figure out what are the most important areas of clash. And I've highlighted a couple here in our show notes, but Lawrence, what do you think is going to be the most important area of clash? And by clash, I mean contestation, like things that you will be debating about with your opponent. You will make an argument, they'll make an argument back. That's what I mean by clash. What is one main area of clash, or your most important area of clash?
So both at camp and in the literature and in a lot of the preparation that I've been doing leading up to this podcast, it seems like the most common place of contestation is the issue of it being a right. So I'd say most people would agree that having a house is probably a good thing. But there's a question in the literature and amongst debaters as why it ought to be a right to housing, and what about a right specifically is necessary or important.
Yeah, I think you're very right about that point, Lawrence. Which is okay. Segue, Kathy. What is your what do you think is the right area of clash to have on this topic?
I think that a big area of clash on this topic comes in maybe two parts. First of all, whether or not it's possible to really guarantee a right to housing and actually make sure that everybody has some form of shelter. And second of all, if passing it as a right is necessarily the right thing to do.
My joke made its way into your mouth too. Excellent.
Notice.
Excellent. So this topic obviously breaches questions of more responsibility and also sort of tangibility. So I think that this topic will be a very fun topic to debate. It seems to address a lot of areas across the philosophical spectrum, and it has a lot of it has a certain vividness to it, and it's honestly just like a topic that we haven't had in the last 10 years, which is somewhat of a novel thing. I mean, I don't know about you two, but I know that a lot of the topics that happen these days, like for example, we get like a nuclear weapons energy topic like every couple of years. We get like a criminal justice reform topic like every single year. But this topic, it seems like at least like reasonably, distinct from other ones. What do you all think?
I agree. I think that what makes this topic very interesting is that it is a issue that is not just political, but also a social issue as well. I think that other topics are either entirely social or entirely political. For instance, things about like nuclear power would be ones that are like very political, but things about criminal justice seem to be more about like what we as a society think is right or wrong. So it's nice to have one that's in between, so you can go both ways if you wanted to.
By political, you mean just like kind of just like political in the sense of like political science, right? Like it just involves
like
policy stuff.
Yeah, like political science and government action and things like that. Very technical things.
No, yeah, that's a good point. A lot of those topics are rigorously divided along those axes. This one isn't quite as rigorously divided. What's like the opposite of divided? Like, is there like another vided that things can be? Like, I know
Unified?
univided. I just want to like divided, univided, whatever. Okay, so let's go into some definition issues. So definition issues are important on most topics, but I think they're kind of particularly important on a topic like this. Lawrence, would you mind helping us to figure out why that might be so?
Yeah, so you could define words in kind of like abusive ways or like not really correct ways and like have topics or debates that are just not useful. So for example, if you just define the right to housing as like, does Lawrence get a house? Well, I'm not sure if that's like a legitimate question to ask as to whether or not I get a house. Or if you define the United States as like Canada, not a good debate to have. But I think
Canada, what's wrong with Canada?
Well, I mean, like that's not the
It's not the
topic. We
United
didn't do any
States.
prep over that.
The United States of Canada? Does Canada have a United States?
They have provinces.
Provinces.
The United Provinces of Canada. That's a good point.
That's not in the resolution.
Yeah, so I think specifically the definitions of like guarantee and right to housing will probably be the most important ones to talk about because they will sort of set the terms for clash arguments and the entire debate.
If the right to housing is defined as Lawrence having a house, is that like every Lawrence?
No, just me because I'm the only important Lawrence.
The only important Lawrence. Shots fired.
I'm just kidding. There's actually
if you are a Lawrence and you feel offended by this, email the argument clinic podcast at gmail.com with a strongly worded letter.
I'm not even Lawrence, and I feel offended by this.
Wow. Yeah, that's how you know that it was an offensive thing. And basically, if your opponent specifies down to a right of housing for Lawrence, well, Lawrence already has a housing situation, so basically would just be presumption every time, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I have a house. I'm in one right now.
Excellent. We know what good debate is. Okay, so let's delve into the specific words in the resolution for real this time. So the first 3 words in the resolution are not particularly divisive. They are the United States. Only important thing to note here is that some topics don't specify the United States, and that can lead to some weirdness because people can start talking about other countries having a right to housing. And it might be weird if the affirmative starts reading statistics from Finland and the negative reads statistics from Australia, and it's like, how does that debate really work? But this topic, seems fairly contained to the United States. But one thing that I've noticed while I was reading about the resolution is that it seems that the right to housing can be accomplished in like a fairly variable number of ways. Is that right, Lawrence?
Yeah, so if you look at the right to housing in the literature, and specifically in other countries that have adopted a specific right to housing, they do it in different ways. So some of them have the right to housing just as like enshrined only in an international human rights document, and that's the only place that it has it. So it's just the federal government that sort of enforces it. Some places specifically use the court system to talk about the right to housing, and they use the courts to, like, for example, in the United States, they might try to use the courts to specifically guarantee it as a right in the Constitution, or a right that ought to be in the Constitution. So I think it could be potentially an issue if someone takes the United States term and makes it specific to a state government or the courts or the executive branch and talks about the way that the right is influenced by that specific branch of government.
and it can be enforced in sort of a lot of different ways, even though it's enshrined in different documents. So what you're saying is that it really does just depend on the country, though, like which of these it is.
Yeah. So I think England and France are the two most common examples of a place that sort of recognize a right to housing or a human right to housing, and they do it a little bit differently.
Interesting. Okay, so I think that's really all we have to talk about the United States. Um, the United States of Mexico is not a thing. It's the United States of America, if any of you were wondering about that. So the next words in the resolution are ought to, but we're not going to talk about that because the word ought has been in every single resolution for the past long time. So ought means something about morality, usually something about pragmatics. There are some weird definitions. Yeah. Okay, so the substance of the resolution. The next word is guarantee. So Kathy, what is your understanding of what this word means?
My understanding of what guarantee means is that, at least for an extended period of time, this is something that absolutely cannot be infringed on. So there are like no exceptions, no way for somebody not to have a right to housing here, because in every instance, there will be one.
Okay, so a guarantee of something is a kind of commitment, at least, to that sort of absolute standard, right? Something like that. Like if I guarantee you something, what I'm doing is I am like pledging myself to do all that's within my powers to accomplish something. Is that right?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so because there was something that you said that I kind of want to talk about a little bit. So when you were talking about guaranteeing, you were mentioning that in order for something to be a guarantee, it kind of has to be absolute. As in, like, in order for something to be a guarantee, you have to be like, very committed to ensuring that that someone gets it. But I think that there is like a sort of very interesting, legitimate question to be asked. So, Kathy, do you think that if someone, let's say promises to do something for someone, and that they fail to deliver on that, not through any fault of their own, just because they were physically unable to do that, would you consider that a guarantee?
I don't think so. I think the end result of what happens is also very important when it says guaranteed. For instance, if you guaranteed me ice cream and I didn't get it, I think that in just the colloquial interpretation of the word, you did not actually guarantee me ice cream. So what that means for the resolution is probably that end states seem to matter at least a little bit.
That's very interesting. Lawrence, what do you think about this question? I'll ask you the same question I posed to Kathy. Do you think that if someone makes a promise to someone else, and they fail to follow through on that promise through no fault of their own, that was a guarantee that they made?
I actually think it kind of is. And I think another example, in addition to the ice cream one, is just sort of one that is basic constitutional law, which is that all people are guaranteed equal treatment before the law. And it's a guarantee that we would say that the United States, ought to follow through on. And it's guarantee. And if we were to phrase the resolution as the United States ought to guarantee equal protection before the law, I think we would all agree that it ought to. And yet we all know for a fact that that most people, or a lot of people, will not, in fact, receive equal treatment before the law. There's tons of court cases about why people don't get equal treatment before the law. Supreme Court debates about this all the time. There are travesties of justice that occur. But just because those instances happen where people are not actually treated equally before the law, I don't think means that the guarantee does not exist, because there's still the United States guaranteeing you equal protection before the law, which I think is a claim that you get to make on the United States to say, hey, you can't discriminate against me. But just because they fall through on it, I don't think necessarily means that there wasn't a guarantee to begin with.
So that's really interesting. I think that the sort of mini debate we have here going on between Kathy and Lawrence about the meaning of the word guarantee is really a question of whether or not sort of a failed promise that you make to someone is a bad guarantee or whether it's not even a guarantee in the first place. And I think that this debate actually has fairly practical consequences for what the affirmative and negative can say on this resolution. And and we should have some discussion about this, Lawrence and Kathy. My belief is that I think that this benefits the affirmative. And I think it benefits the affirmative because it allows the affirmative to say that negative feasibility counterexamples are not part of the resolution. And here's what I mean by that. So let's say the negative makes the argument that people under a right to housing will not really get houses, or implementing the right to housing doesn't actually ensure that people will get houses or not. And therefore, the negative will use that. They'll cite that as a problem with the affirmative. They'll say the affirmative doesn't accomplish their goals. They fail to achieve whatever benefits, moral or otherwise, that they describe. And therefore, the reasons stated to vote affirmative are kind of lessened dramatically. So, but I think that the affirmative, with this interpretation of the word many, Kathy's interpretation of a promise not even being a guarantee at all, if no one can follow through, my belief is that that benefits the affirmative, because the affirmative can then say to all of these feasibility arguments, hey, those are just not even examples of the resolution. Those cases where people didn't get those houses, that proves they weren't really guaranteed a right to housing because they didn't get houses. So I think that that allows the affirmative to get out of a lot of negative arguments, because they can say those examples you cited are sort of interesting, situations, but those aren't the situation of the resolution. The affirmative should be able to assume, based on the resolution, that everyone gets to be in a bunch of houses now. Does anyone disagree with me on who this benefits?
So I'm not 100% sure if that's the way that I interpret that argument, because it seems like on face that if the affirmative fails to guarantee the right to housing to large sections of people, well, then that might implicate its ability to actually, that might actually implicate whether or not the United States ought to guarantee a right to housing if it can't really do so successfully. I think probably the most common way this argument is phrased is ought implies can. And if you can't really guarantee everyone, or at least a substantial majority of everyone, a right to housing, then maybe you ought not guarantee it in the first place. So it might actually be good for the negative to make this sort of argument about how guarantee requires a successful outcome.
So the idea is that, correct me if I'm wrong, guarantee requires that the outcome be successful, but because that is not possible, then we ought not give guarantees in the first place.
Yeah, that seems like a way to think about the term guarantee in the resolution.
I don't know if I quite agree. Kathy, what do you think about this?
I think that those arguments actually kind of interact. I remember I kept hearing a lot of debates that ended up going in that direction, i.e. the negative argument about ought implies can would be read first, but then the affirmative would be an answer to that. Of course, that would require other engagements on a more theoretical level of debate that says like whether or not ought really does mean that we need to care about whether or not we can do something. But I think that at the end of the day, that debate can actually go either way in terms of who it helps.
Good point. Just to clarify something for our listeners, when Lawrence and Kathy, when you all are talking about sort of ought implying can, what is the basic argument that you're referencing?
Oh, so I believe this argument actually has its origins in Immanuel Kant, who we talked about in the last episode of Utilitarianism versus
My main
Deontology.
man, the big K.
Which is just basically that moral obligations must be sort of feasible, doable, achievable, and it's generally reduced to the simple statement ought implies can, and the general sentiment is that you ought not do things that you cannot possibly do. So, for example, I probably don't have a moral obligation to save a drowning baby if, for example, I am incapable of swimming, or I probably don't have a moral obligation to do brain surgery to save someone's life, because I'd probably actually kill them if I tried to perform brain surgery on them. I'm not qualified to do that at all. So you are only really obligated to do things that you are capable of doing, or else it seems like morality kind of loses its ability to be a guiding force, because it would just tell you to do things that you couldn't do, or would actually result in worse things if you tried to do them.
Yeah, I understand and agree with most of the things that you said, except for the part where you said you couldn't do brain surgery. Look, Lawrence, I believe in you.
I'm sure if you truly believe in me at VBI this year, let's see if we can get an operating table, and we'll see how successful brain surgery on you really is.
Ooh, that is a good point. That's a good challenge. I don't know. I don't know. We'll see if you're up to the task. I don't know if my brain can get much worse. So we'll have to see. Effie, I'll give you a chance here. Do you think Lawrence can successfully perform brain surgery on me to save my life from nothing?
Doubtful.
Doubtful. Hmm.
I
Why
wouldn't.
why am I the only one that has faith in Lawrence on this podcast?
Maybe because you need brain surgery.
That is a good point. I certainly
Got
do.
him.
Got me indeed. So let's talk about the next section of words in the resolution, the right to housing. So first of all, before we talk about what right to housing means, it's kind of awkward that there's a the in the resolution, right? Like instead of a right to housing, how it's the right to housing. Isn't that kind of weird?
Yeah, I mean, like, it seems like there's a ton of different ways that you could define a right to housing, which we'll talk about here in a second. So it seems weird to refer to it as the right to housing, as if there's only the right and no other possible interpretation of the right to housing. Like, what is the right to housing?
Kathy, do you think it's possible that by the right to housing, they were referring to like a specific one, maybe one in like literature, like the UN and something like that? Like, do you think that's the reason why they put the in the resolution, or you maybe think it's something else?
Honestly, I don't really think it matters. I think regardless of whether or not it is a right to housing versus the right to housing, like debaters are going to have arguments about what a/the right to housing really means in the first place.
Yeah, that's a good point. It really doesn't matter that much. I was just sort of thinking about it. So basically, Kathy, you would advise people not bickering about this in their debates.
No, I don't think a versus the is the point of contestation, not more so than the words right to housing itself.
Yeah, that's not the key crux of clash on the resolution, whether or not it should have been the or a right to housing. Okay, so Lawrence, can you walk me through like the main definition? So like the main definition for right to housing that I've seen and what a lot of people cite just kind of lists a bunch of conditions. And I like my understanding is that it comes from the United Nations. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the one that is like most commonly cited by other authors who are like, this is what a right to housing really is.
Okay, so like, what can you just like, just kind of list the things that the UN definition includes?
Okay, so it's 7 things, and we'll talk about each of them really briefly here. So the first one is tenure. The second one is availability. The third one is affordability. The fourth one is habitability. The fifth one is accessibility. The sixth one is location. And the seventh one is cultural adequacy. So some of these
before we go into that, maybe we should have a nice little acronym so that people can understand. So tenure T, availability A, affordability A, habitability H, accessibility A, location L, cultural adequacy C. So Tahalk, TAAHALC.
The most beautiful sound I've ever heard. Tahalk.
Talc, indeed. It sounds like the name of a medication that gets some ailment that you don't tell people about to stop from happening. Talc.
I advocate we stretch out the A. I think there are 2 A's in there. I think it's better Tahalk.
Tahalk.
Oh, perfect.
Tahalk. Yeah. Maybe you need to say it
Ta-
extra loudly because there are two A's. Tahalk. You just need to like kind of just like shout it. So tenure, availability, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy. All right. Sorry to interrupt you, Lawrence. Can you then maybe go through some of the specific ones here?
So some of these are sort of generally accepted parts of the right to housing, no matter sort of how you interpret it. The few at the bottom are a little bit more complex, and we'll talk about them. So we're just going to walk through each of them really quickly and talk about what they mean. So the first one is tenure, the first part of Tahalk, which is just basically that you should be protected against forced evictions and harassment and threats. So people can't just kick you out of your house for no reason. And so you have tenure. You're guaranteed that you can stay in one location without being kicked out for no justifiable reason. The second one is availability, and that's short for availability of services, materials, facilities, and infrastructure. So it basically just means that you need to live in a place that is capable of being considered livable for your health, security, and comfort. So it needs to have safe drinking water. It should have heating, lighting, washing facilities, and sanitation. If it doesn't have that, it's probably not a good house to live in. So the third part is affordability, which just means that you should be able to afford a house. You probably don't have a right to housing if, in order to live in that house, you have to pay $20,000 a month to live there. That seems, kind of hard to justify. So you should be able to afford a house as well as other basic needs. So you shouldn't have to like choose between paying your rent or buying food. Next one is habitability, which just basically means like this house needs to be more than just like a tent. It should be able to protect you from the weather and other threats to your health. So it should protect you from like the cold, heat, rain, wind, etc. Next one is accessibility. This one just means that houses need to be accessible to all, including those who might need, for example, wheelchair services, and so that way they can access this house. So these first five are generally considered pretty like obvious. Like if you have a right to housing, these seems like very basic baseline things that you would have. It's the last two that sort of puts in a little bit of like people are a bit confused about why they're there. So number 6 is location, which not only refers to basic like you shouldn't like build houses in like the middle of nuclear waste dumps, for instance. Like the location should be like very reasonable for you to live in. But the UN definition says that it needs to be in a location that allows you employment options, healthcare services, childcare centers, and other social facilities like a wellness center nearby, which seems a little harder to justify as an inherent right. Like, is there an inherent right to live in a place that is like within walking distance of your favorite like gym, like Gold's Gym? And that seems harder to justify. And the final one is cultural adequacy. And this one just means that housing policies and housing locations must guarantee the expression of cultural identity and diversity, including the preservation of cultural landmarks and institutions. And this is also a little bit controversial because it's really hard to define what cultural adequacy really means and whether or not housing policies are compliant with this standard. And so people are less hesitant to, or more hesitant to grant this as sort of a key tenet of the right to housing. But the first 5 things are definitely really important.
Kathy, do you have anything to add on those conditions of Tahalk?
Not much. It seems like Lawrence got them all pretty well.
Yeah, I definitely have nothing to add. That seemed pretty comprehensive. So let's talk about what housing means. When you all were doing research on the topic, I'm sure that you found about a lot of stuff about the right to shelter, in addition to the right to housing. Are those things the same for all intents and purposes? Like, I couldn't find someone saying that there was a difference.
It seems to me that the difference I found in more informal parts of the literature, so like not like super fancy long dissertations written by social scientists, is that housing is something a little more like temporally permanent than a shelter. For instance, we call places like homeless shelters are like shelters, but not necessarily housing, because housing seems to imply that this is a place that is like yours and at least like for a longer period of time than what you could say a shelter would be.
Lawrence, do you agree? I mean, that's how I would put it. But
Yeah, plus this, I would agree. Plus, it doesn't really seem like a huge point of contestation. Like once we sort of generally accept what a right to housing is, the distinction between it and a right to shelter seems a little less important to the debate itself.
Yeah, that's true. And also, the negative can't really call the affirmative out on their cards saying the right to shelter or the right to housing, because that means that all of the negative cards that they're going to read that say the right to shelter on them don't work anymore either. So I think this will be one of those things that people just grant to other people. So I agree with both of you on that. So one thing that I've looked at in a lot of the rights-based literature, and another separate question about the right to housing, is whether there's a difference between the right to housing and the right to adequate housing. I've seen a lot of legal literature talking about the importance of the right to adequate housing. My belief is that, like the above distinctions, that the right to adequate housing kind of isn't really that relevant, because the UN definition that we talked about was pretty expansive. I mean, a lot of those right to housing things are kind of about its adequacy, you know, tenure, accessibility, habitability, affordability. Like those things are quote adequate end quote housing for me. Do you guys think that is there a difference that you've discovered that I've missed?
Yeah, I think that's about right. I mean, like the right to adequate housing seems to basically just be the UN definition of a right to housing.
Yeah, I think so. I think so as well. Um, Okay, so another question. So this is kind of like a more philosophical-ish question, but so the resolution says the right to housing in it. And it's easy to gloss over the word right because we hear about it so much in kind of like popular culture, in literature, and stuff like that. But I think, it might be important to try to figure out like exactly what is a right, especially since, as we talked about earlier, this is one of the central points of clash in the resolution, whether or not housing should be a right versus some other random thing. So a right, as kind of a sort of vague thing, is basically an entitlement. You get to do something or have something not happen to you. And um, it's, kind of stronger than a lot of other things. Like you would consider a right to be broken, like that's a pretty serious infringement, versus a kind of thing that like maybe you aren't as owed sort of so vividly. Like, I don't have a right to 7-Eleven serving specific milkshakes or fruit freezes or whatever. I don't go to 7-Eleven, as you can tell, because I just said milkshakes. But 7-Eleven definitely does not have milkshakes.
It does. It has the it's like it's a milkshake that like comes into in a cup and you just put it in the milkshake machine and it makes it into a milkshake for you.
Well, that's how you know I don't go to 7-Eleven, because I accidentally said they had milkshakes. Then I apologized for them not having milkshakes, and then it turned out they had milkshakes the whole time.
Yeah, I didn't know they had milkshakes. I thought they only had Slurpees.
Uh yeah. Well, it depends. So like I think one of the 7-Elevens in my city has the milkshake thing, and the other like one of the and some of the others don't. So,
Oh, I think I know the thing that you're talking
I-
about. Is it the like you like buy these like frozen things and then you put them in this thing and it spins it and then you have a milkshake?
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
They had those in my school. Well, I just completely derailed the conversation here. All right. So just
they have it at McDonald's. It's pretty nice.
yeah, I would get one and then I would drink it and then I would be like, Martin, why are you like this? Why did you just destroy that whole milkshake? This is bad. Um, so it's probably better for me that there aren't more of those machines around. So, all right. So I don't have a right to a 7-Eleven having a milkshake machine. I'll stand by my initial comment. Um, so I can't, for example, sue 7-Eleven because they don't have a milkshake machine and argue that it's like a human right that I have or something. But on the other hand, if someone gives me, the old gentleman's stab, and then I'm saying, "Hey, police, come arrest this person," and they're like, "Nah, not feeling it," like there's some rights violations there, somewhere in and around that scene. Um, so okay, so there are broadly two types of rights, and I think it's very important on this topic to understand what is the difference between these two types of rights. And you'll see this come up in sort of like modern parlance and discussions of just normal things in society. But so I'm talking about a positive versus a negative right. So Lawrence, what is the difference between a positive right and a negative right? Like first, like what are they? And second, like what's the difference?
So positive and negative rights are sort of the main point of difference between a lot of political philosophies. And the general idea is that a positive right is a positive claim to something, and a negative right is a claim that something not be done to you. So an example of a negative right are most of the rights that we would consider intrinsic to human beings. So the right to life is not really a right to like take someone's life. It's a right that no one take your life. No one can kill you, or at least they ought not be able to. Or a right, for example, to liberty, which is a right to not have other people interfere with your daily business so long as you're not doing anything like particularly wrong. And those are just claims for people to do nothing to you. They should stay out of your way. End of story.
Positive rights are the right to sort of be able to go out and do something and to have someone assist you in that. And a negative right is the right to have someone not do something to you, like the right to not be murdered. Like, of course. A quick note, by the way, just a quick sort of funny note on the right to life. So when I was at Novice, I was in some Novice lab at debate camp. And then someone mentioned the right to life. And I remember sitting there thinking and being like, what are these people talking about? The right to life isn't in the Constitution. That's not a right. What are these people don't know what they're talking about. That was a thing that Small Martin thought. So did you all have similar experiences with the right to life, or am I right in assuming, in assuming that I'm the only one that had this thought?
I think it was just you.
I think you're the only one.
dang nabbit.
Might have to revisit this brain surgery thing.
well, now I know there's a right to life. But back then I was just like, look, I know me some Constitution, even though I didn't know anything about the Constitution. I was just like, that doesn't exist. And someone had to explain it to me later. One sort of non-nonsense point that this brings up, though, is that so rights, to be clear, when we're talking about like giving someone a right to something, usually that means that it becomes encoded in like a legal document, for example. But when people are talking about positive, negative rights and the rights people have, as Lauren said, as humans, they're not talking about legal system rights. Like, that's not why you have a right to housing, for example. It's not because it's in the legal system. In debate, at least. Am I right? Am I right in thinking that? Like, normally when people in debate are talking about the rights people have, they mean like as people, or the rights people should have, rather than like just like a enumeration of your constitutional protections. Is that right, Kathy?
I think for the most part that's right. On certain topics or in certain issues, specifically about whether or not legal rights are good, I think that there may be some sort of a distinction. But for the most part, given that LD is pretty philosophical as a debate, yeah, I would say that's accurate.
Yeah. So for example, obviously the negative could not stand up and argue that the right to housing doesn't exist because it's not in the Constitution yet.
Yeah, I don't think that's a valid neg argument.
Yeah.
Without some form of like a evaluative term on it, i.e. like if something should be a right in the Constitution, yeah, that's totally a neg argument. But the fact that it isn't now, and so isn't really a neg argument in itself, no.
Yeah, I agree. All right, Lawrence, now to let you talk about what is the relation of positive and negative rights to the resolution.
Yeah, so the positive right is sort of, as we mentioned, the claim to something. So most people would say that the right to housing is a positive right because it requires proactive work on someone else to give you a house. Like, if you have a right to housing in a positive sense, it's not like a right to like something not be done to you. It's a right to like occupy a house and live in it. Whereas there are some people who think that the right to housing is merely negative, which is the right to not be kicked out of your house once you have it. And so if we look back to the UN definition that we just had and talked about, if you notice the first part, it was security of tenure, which is the right to not get evicted or kicked out of your house. That's a negative right part of a right to housing. But the UN definition expands upon it and then claims it's a positive right because you have positive claims to things like an affordable house or a house in a good location, things that aren't just merely people doing nothing onto you. So there is and it seems like the most common definitions think that the right to housing has both a positive and a negative component, but there are other authors who think that it's merely positive or other authors who think it is merely negative.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that the positive versus negative right things on this topic, I think that it's very important to understanding why people object, for example, to the right to housing, or why people are, so much for it. Okay, so I think that's a pretty good explanation of what the topic is generally. And in the next section, we'll be talking about some arguments in favor of the resolution and some arguments against the resolution. All right, so the first thing that we're going to talk about is affirmative arguments. So before we get into some specific affirmative arguments, and we're going to go through 3 affirmative arguments and 3 negative arguments as well. So before we go into that, though, I think it's important to establish that there is one sort of main temptation that I think will affect all of us when we're attempting to write or coach arguments on this topic about what arguments to make in the affirmative case. And I believe that what a lot of people will do, and you should punish them if they try to do this, and by punish them, I don't mean just inflict physical violence on them. I mean, make arguments against them, to be clear. So when they say is that, I think that a lot of times the affirmative will try to just read a lot of evidence about how bad the housing crisis is as kind of a standalone argument in favor of the affirmative. For example, they will read a lot of evidence. They will say, here's a piece of evidence that, let's say, veterans are sort of afflicted badly by the right to housing. Then second, here's a piece of evidence describing how few people have houses. Third, here's a piece of evidence describing the conditions in some of those houses. There is a huge temptation, I think, on this topic to just list off a bunch of reasons why not having houses stinks. And I believe, and let me know what you all think about this, that is actually a huge mistake. I believe that the negative will not have a problem with those parts of the affirmative case, and that therefore those are kind of wastes of time. I believe personally that the affirmative should maybe make one sort of powerfully worded piece of evidence, but think that the affirmative should not waste a bunch of time reading 5 cards about this. And that's because I don't think that the main point of clash between the affirmative and the negative on this resolution will be about whether it's bad not to have a house, because it is sort of very obviously bad not to have a house. And it's obvious to anyone who read the first page of any article on this topic that there are a lot of harms. There are a lot of people without houses. Lack of housing affects them negatively. But that is not by itself a reason to vote affirmative unless you prove that that means that people should have a right to housing. So I think that the main line of negative contestation will be about whether giving people a right to housing, let's say, works in solving the housing crisis, rather than about whether or not the housing crisis is bad. Lawrence, what do you think about what I just said? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me?
Yeah, and I think this sort of ties in well to our sort of first AF argument that we're going to discuss, because I think that there are sort of 2 main ways to make the affirmative case for right to housing. And so the first one is just sort of like there is an intrinsic right to housing. You establish some philosophical position and say, by the very nature of this philosophy or this ethical theory, housing is a right. But I think the other approach you could sort of adopt is just like, even if there is no actual like really rigorous thought out philosophical justification for what a right is, that you can sort of incorporate some of the arguments that you just talked about, like, housing crisis is really bad, things that we all agree with, And instead of just talking about why it would be nice if people had a house, we make an argument for why rights are specifically key to fixing these sort of problems, which I think leads really well into our first argument that we're going to talk about for the affirmative.
Yeah, I definitely agree, as we will soon see. But Kathy, what do you think about the point that I've made about where exactly the affirmative should spend their time? When you were at camp, did you see a lot of affirmatives that would just spend a bunch of time arguing that the housing crisis was bad?
I think I heard a good amount of arguments about why the housing crisis was bad, but I don't think any were especially excessive. And I think the reason for that is that what you're saying, Martin, is very like correct and intuitive. I think it's important to have at least one impact in there, talking just about the extent of homelessness and the housing crisis in the world right now. Just to at least like show the impact that the app has and how much it'll do and how much like good it will bring to the world. But I don't think that's necessarily something that should be like excessively elaborated upon, because it shouldn't be the negative's job to really argue that like homelessness is good or that we don't have a homeless problem. Because I think at that point, it's not really a debate anymore. I think it's pretty obvious that there are homeless people out there, and that is not really a good thing.
Look, I have heard some debaters in my local circuit make the most absurd of arguments.
Oh, please don't make homelessness good.
Yes. That is not a winner. You heard it here first. Homelessness, bad.
No, it builds character. That's the important thing in life.
It builds character. Well, I don't think they're getting a lot built for them in homelessness. I think that's the main issue. There's not much being built. If people are building character rather than building, houses, foundations for a roof, then I think that's good. Is a character substitute for a house, Lawrence?
It's better than a house.
It's better than a house. That's good. That's good. We
sounds like you might need a move out, Lawrence.
Yeah, we defend justice on this podcast, okay? And by justice, I mean, the lack of necessity of homeless people having houses versus character. You heard it. You heard it here first, JK. So, all right, let's go into the first argument, the first affirmative contention argument that we're going to present. And for this one, I'm going to rely a lot on Lawrence. When he was talking about what a lot of affirmatives would do, the first thing that he mentioned was that there would be sort of a philosophical justification for rights, and that would be a way of proving the resolution true. Lawrence, can you elaborate on that sort of moral justification for rights a bit more as our first argument?
Yeah, so most affirmatives should probably try to establish what a right is. So earlier on in the top of the podcast, we were talking about like what the difference between positive and negative rights are. What we left out is a discussion about what is a right and what justifiably is a right in a moral sense. And so there are different ways to sort of derive what we would consider like core fundamental rights. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that something is a human right if it is like necessary to protect human dignity, and then lists a bunch of things that happen. There's more like reaction approaches to rights, which simply say that like there have been abuses that have happened in the past, and in order to prevent them, we must establish a right to prevent those abuses from happening. And that's actually one of the other justifications for the UN Declaration for Human Rights. The Constitution references some rights as like being God-given, and some people justify rights as just being like an intrinsic part of being human. And there's different ways to justify like how you get a right. And so I think this is the first type of affirmative argument, which is like, here is a justification or an ethical theory or philosophy that explains what a right is and how we get it, and then argues that housing is one of those rights.
Fair enough. So with all of these arguments, we're going to talk about kind of like what they are and also how you might go about answering them. So Kathy, tell me if I'm wrong. It seems like the best way of answering these sort of affirmative cases would be to argue a counter interpretation of what a right is, or argue that a counter moral theory through maybe a value criterion is correct.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there are two big ways of seeing these apps answered. The first is just a turn saying that rights aren't necessarily good, which we can get into when we talk about the neg. And the second is just a different framing argument, because I think that this argument is very conceptual and just speaks about like just rights in themselves, but doesn't necessarily talk about like real effects. And so I think a framework that wins that and then makes an argument such as the ought implies can one that Lawrence and I were talking about earlier could pretty easily take this app out.
Okay. From my point of view, I think that the framework would be a good way of answering this type of position, because once you grant a lot of the sort of criterion assumptions that this case is making, it can become difficult to answer certain parts of the contention. Because if they're kind of just say, look, all I need to do to prove that something is a right is this small thing, and then I do that, like, it could be a much better, like, it seems like kind of a poor move would be to attack only the contention in that case. For example, you would definitely want to spend a decent amount of time on framework, much as you would want to spend a decent amount of money on the important stuff.
Yeah. Like answering the contention of this sort of position would be very difficult, because it just seems like on face, yeah, housing seems very closely related to a bunch of other rights that we sort of agree with, like the right to life or liberty. And it seems like necessary for the enjoyment of other rights like health, security, education, privacy. And it seems like being without a house leaves you unable to enjoy a bunch of things that we would consider necessary for like basic human living, like protection, water, sanitation. And so trying to answer that on the contention level seems difficult. Instead, I think it makes more sense to address like what it means to be a right and prove a distinction between the other rights that were being mentioned, and explain why housing is in fact not a right in a moral sense.
So one thing before we move on, to kind of put this into clear context, a lot of the arguments presented here will have to be positive rights good arguments, right? They'll have to say like, it's more important to go out and achieve something. I mean, a lot of the negative clash will be, actually rights are only negative rights are the ones that you have, and therefore, if if the negative proves that negative rights are the only important thing, then they certainly have like a much better shot at answering this sort of affirmative case, and we'll obviously talk about that later. All right, so the second affirmative argument that we're going to talk about is something that Lawrence maybe mentioned a little briefly when Lawrence was talking about the types of affirmatives that could answer. The first one was the moral one we just talked about, and the second one was kind of a catch-all for ways of using rights for positive ends, like to solve things like the housing crisis. And so both this affirmative argument and the next affirmative argument will be of this type, and it'll be about why might rights be a good strategy to deal with the housing crisis. And the first has to do with legitimacy. So the legitimacy thing is, as I understand it, the argument is that calling something a right gives it a lot more power, both in its ability to sort of control how the government responds to it, as well as to convince people that it's, some good stuff. So that's my understanding of the argument. I've seen, I believe her name is Kristen Adams, make this argument particularly well. And it's basically that we imbue rights with a fairly significant amount of force in United States culture, as well as, culture internationally. When we say something is a right, it really means that it has to be taken seriously. And therefore, making housing into a right versus just something that it might be good for people to get sometimes might have a much better chance of actually leading to positive change on issues of housing. Lawrence, what do you think about the argument I just presented, or is there anything that you would add to describing the way that the argument is fleshed out?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a good affirmative argument because it allows you to sort of escape the negative objections about like what a right is. So like maybe the negative proposes a counter ethical theory and is like, no, here's how we derive what rights are, and here's why housing is not one of them. Well, you could just be like, well, housing is really bad, and if we just call it or homelessness, not sorry, homelessness is really bad. Housing is good, as we mentioned earlier. And
Well, we've already established that Lawrence doesn't actually think homelessness is bad because it builds character. Is that right?
oh
So-
yeah, I'm sorry, I flip flop on
clear.
my positions.
Uh,
But
I like flip flops too. I wear them all the time.
that's gross. And so that a right to housing is specifically necessary to like get things done. It creates a sense of legitimacy. And so you're right. Kristen Adams is the author that talks about this along with a bunch of others. And she sort of points out that in 1949, we like made some random commitment that was like, here's why there's some housing, but it didn't use the term right to housing. And as a result, people were like less willing to buy it as legitimate. Laws weren't very clear about this. No one really enforced it. So if we were to call it a right to housing, it'd be like really, really good. And people would be more likely to follow through with it and give it more moral force. And I think this sort of can bypass a lot of the negative arguments about a counter-ethical philosophy, because you can just sort of grant that and say, well, it'd still be good if we called it a right because it gets like rid of homelessness.
So it sounds like what this argument is really about is kind of like, look, it might be that the right to housing is not like intrinsically required, perhaps, to be a right on the basis of some status that it has, but it might be good to instrument, like for instrumental reasons, aka like to just because it achieves some other purpose, to call housing a right. It's instrumental, aka like it's an instrument to something else. But it might be a good instrument. You know,
Yeah.
it might be that maybe it's not like the best right in the philosophical sense of the word, but maybe, you know, doing that will help us achieve other rights or some other positive goals that your value criterion will designate. Okay, so Kathy, what would be some ways of perhaps responding to this argument? Now, this argument is, you know, a lot about kind of the consequences of implementing a right to housing. From your work at camp, do you think that there are kind of resources for the negative to say that maybe rights, you know, calling something a right maybe doesn't achieve the results that I've been preaching about?
Sure. I think that the intuitive way to answer this is that just to deny the effects that they're trying to claim for by just saying that like calling something a right doesn't necessarily mean that it will actually happen, right? I think there are probably a number of good examples where we call things rights, but they don't actually happen. For instance, we were just talking about like a lot of social injustices and how like terrible things happen despite the fact that we like call them rights. Another argument I've seen against this is that calling it a right seems to lull the app into a fake sense of safety in that, okay, we've already declared this a right, so then we can ignore a lot of other structural problems going on with it, and then it will just end up hiding the problem because we think we've already solved it, but we actually have just either not really changed much or actually made it worse.
Yes. So I think that that's like a pretty good point. There are a lot of rights, as you said, that really don't translate themselves into like tangible protections for things. I think this is a kind of obvious when you look at other countries, but also pretty obvious when you look at United States. I mean, there are really like, for example, we have a right to the equal protection of the laws. Kathy, would you say that you know, in the current society, that everyone has the equal protection of the laws?
Not necessarily, no.
Not necessarily. I mean, as we all know from judging or maybe even debating on the qualified immunity topic, we really have a long way to go in terms of making sure that there's justice for everyone. So just because something is a right doesn't mean that America like really is that great at trying to get it to work.
I also think there's another way to respond to this topic or this argument. So as I was saying, like the benefit to this argument is you get to bypass negative framework arguments or philosophy arguments about what constitutes a right, because you're just like, well, they could be right, but we should still call it a right. But I don't actually think it necessarily escapes that problem, because in order for the affirmative to win that calling something a right is good, they still have to win a philosophical justification for that. And in this case, it's probably sort of like more utilitarian, like we have to win that the consequences of it are good. But I think you would also have to win an additional argument that consequences and good consequences are the sufficient basis for a right. So the negative can still contest whether or not the affirmative's declaration of what constitutes a right is whether or not it's legitimate or not. And the negative can still forward philosophy arguments about why, no, that's not what rights are anyways, and still contest on that level. So I don't think the affirmative necessarily gets away with bypassing the philosophy debate.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that the philosophy debate on the negative will come up a lot, and I think that's one of the main negative tools that they'll have to win on. So the last argument, the third argument that we'll talk about, is kind of about the equal enforcement of existing laws. And basically, what I meant by this is I found a bunch of articles alleging that, look, there really are current laws that exist to help people get houses, but and maybe even federal regulations. But a lot of times those regulations are not only not enforced, but enforced unevenly. For example, on racial lines, or on sort of very obviously socioeconomic lines. And so that creates a problem where existing housing codes are being applied disproportionately and in a discriminatory way. So that's my understanding of this argument. Lawrence, when you were researching just generally for camp, did you find anything that was kind of like this, made this argument?
Yeah, and I think some authors even phrased it in a slightly different way, which was just that most people sort of recognize that housing is good because we have so many laws that are designed to promote affordable housing and to protect people from getting kicked out of their homes. But for some reason, we're just really averse to using the term rights. So these authors sort of assume like housing is good. We basically think it is a right. We just haven't called it one yet. We all sort of intuitively think that housing is a right, and we should just call it a right, and that would help get rid of these like large sections of unnecessary laws that are just like really piecemeal and they don't really fit together well. And we just have a coherent conception of like housing is good, let's call it a right.
So there's a lot of kind of different ways that people are enforcing people getting houses, right? That's kind of what you meant by it being a really piecemeal approach. Like there's just like a lot of different codes that are enforced differently by different people with varying degrees of strength.
Yeah.
And that can sometimes have negative impacts, even beyond just the fact that people aren't getting houses.
Right.
So, Kathy, did you come across this argument, or maybe a way of answering it?
Sure. I think that the argument is very similar to another argument brought up a little earlier, that calling it a right doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to be able to enforce it exactly to the standards of which we would like it to be enforced. So just as other things are obviously like called rights, but not necessarily enforced equally, right? Especially when it comes into like things like people of lower incomes getting different rights and privileges in a actual physical sense than those with higher incomes. The argument can be made here as well, saying that it doesn't necessarily actually get equal protection, but it just like calling it, saying that it does, makes us act like it does.
Okay, so basically what I'm hearing is that that calling something a right sort of purports to, and this is an argument against this, calling something a right purports to allow for maybe better enforcement of rights, or of something that maybe we're due, like better enforcing of laws, but kind of rights don't even really guarantee that. Lawrence, can you maybe think of some examples of cases where rights haven't really, we're calling something a right really hasn't really helped very much that laws are enforced?
So I think the most common example is just sort of torture. There's like international human rights documents that are like you shouldn't like torture other people, and yet the United States still does it despite it being a right guaranteed to not be tortured. Or the right to privacy is generally considered pretty standard, and it's enshrined across the world in human rights documents, and yet the United States still has a large domestic surveillance apparatus, which undoubtedly violates the right to privacy. So just calling something a right doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be protected.
That's a good point, and let's move on to our next section.
Okay.
So on to our negative section. I think the first point that we're going to make here kind of surprises no one. It's the positive rights bad position. Lawrence, can you give us an account of sort of who thinks positive rights are bad and why they think they're bad?
Yeah, so the most common debate-related position about why positive rights are bad is just libertarianism, and sort of the most common author for this is Robert Nozick, who we will talk about in some later Argument Clinic podcast. The basic argument that he makes is that positive rights impose undue claims upon other people, which to fulfill your obligations. So, for example, the right to education requires a teacher to teach you, and that, he says, is an unjust or immoral like extension or obligation that you impose upon other people and cannot be allowed. So the most common argument in modern political discourse is about positive rights is about healthcare, and libertarians think that a right to healthcare is a positive right and therefore cannot be allowed because it requires, for example, doctors to give you health services even if you cannot pay them, which he thinks is wrong. And so in the similar case, the libertarians will think that a right to housing is wrong because it requires you to say, I have a legitimate claim to this house, and requires someone else to build that house, to run that house, to make that house affordable to you, and to provide that house to you, which he thinks are unjust and immoral.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that libertarianism is also pretty tied in with the value criterion that people select. And correct me if I'm wrong, Kathy, but it seems like a lot of the sort of negative rights good, positive rights bad people, that a lot of them are kind of deontological thinkers, kind of in scope.
I think that's probably the case. An argument like this definitely seems to rely a lot on framework, much like a lot of regular negative arguments here. I think that Innes the Af is saying a lot about how like saying this is a right is good. Having a stance that seems like saying that rights in general are not good requires a different sort of framing that seems to depart from like the general way we view things.
That's a good point. I do, though, think that it's very possible to make arguments for why positive rights are bad and negative rights are good that are actually not really at all related to specific things about the importance of deontology and side constraints as sort of fundamental principles. For example, I think that you could very easily make the argument that negative rights are good and positive rights are bad because positive rights maybe cheapen the value of negative rights, or if there are positive rights that kind of leads to an explosion of potential rights, or there are just tons and tons of rights and things become much more difficult to evaluate. So, Lawrence, are those people that I'm talking about really just kind of different types of libertarians? Or are they like sort of different philosophical people altogether?
Well, I think like a lot of libertarians make that argument as an additional extension of their reasoning for why positive rights are bad, but like that's not the core of their argument. They just sort of say that that also does, as a side effect, cheapen the effect of negative rights.
When you say that it's an extension of an argument that they already make, do you mean that they made the argument in one speech and then they're trying to bring it into the next speech? Is that what you...
Yeah, exactly.
Is that what you're saying?
No,
exactly.
Not really. No, just like their core thesis is that positive rights violate other people's negative rights because it requires, for example, someone to sacrifice their liberty or their labor to give you a house, and that is unjust. And they also then are like, well, here's one more point to prove my point, which is that it cheapens the effect of those negative rights, and it kind of does for two reasons. Not only does it add more additional rights that are harder to fulfill, which means that we probably take them less seriously, but because it violates other people's negative rights, and that's why it's bad.
Ooh, it violates other people's negative rights. That's interesting. Do you think that like the term negative rights just refers to like the right of a negative debater? Like the term just like negative rights just only applies to when you're actually neg in a debate round?
Yeah, I think that's the only reasonable interpretation of what negative rights are.
I couldn't agree more, Lawrence. I think that that's what we've been talking about um, for the whole podcast, listeners. That's what you should think we mean by negative rights. Negative rights, good. You're saying it. Although I guess that is kind of like a decent way to remember it, right? It's like negative rights because on this topic you're the negative when you're arguing about negative rights. So that's pretty much. I mean, like I don't know, like you're just a novice trying to figure out how to make your way through the world, and it's like, well, I know that their negative rights are good because I'm negative this round. So, although that might lead to being interesting things when you're saying, okay, never mind. I was about to say something stupid. Okay, so
So I think there's one other sort of argument for why positive rights are bad, which is that libertarians tend to argue that that rights must, by definition, be universal and apply to all people. Otherwise, they're not really rights; they're more just like wants. Like, for example, there's probably not a right to like an LG TV. Because not everyone gets to have an LG TV, and that's probably like a claim that you can't justifiably make. Nothing intrinsically good about having an LG TV. And so they make the argument that positive rights are fail this test of universality because they require other people to do things, even if that good or service does not exist. So in the context of, for example, healthcare, what happens if there's no doctor willing to perform the procedure? What happens if that procedure does not exist? So how can you have a positive right to healthcare? And so libertarians make the same argument in the context of housing, for instance. What happens if there are no houses? What happens if there is no one that builds a house? What happens if there's just simply not a demand or a supply available, and there's just only a demand for housing? Well, if that's the case, then it proves that rights to housing don't make sense because it's not universal. It's dependent on the availability of someone to provide that to you, which means it is not universal and therefore cannot be a right.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things that aren't universal. For example, I think Disney is kind of not universal, right? I mean, like, I think that it's definitely like a different studio and a different theme park.
But the good news is they're just right across from each other in Florida.
Right across from each other. That is true. Maybe Disney and Universal are just the same thing. Maybe I've been thinking about it badly the whole time.
It's a conspiracy.
I think
all of them are just run by like one person.
All right, let's take a vote. I say University and Disney are different things. Kathy, what's your vote?
I say different as well. I think
Different.
Disney is much more enjoyable.
Never mind. I'm switching my vote. They're the same.
I think it's run by the reanimated corpse of Walt Disney, who is just running all of the entertainment industries in the world.
Okay, we'll call that a
Wasn't he actually like
the three-way tie.
Yeah.
Wait. What were you about to say? Something about him being frozen?
Oh yeah, he was like, wasn't his body like frozen in ice or something like that? It was like some weird science thing that
Like
meant that,
Captain America?
Yeah, like, exactly like that. So we can like find a technology to like thaw him out later or something like that.
Jeez. If we like resurrect Walt Disney, will he like fight ISIS for us?
I guess,
That
but
would
it
be
was like,
sick.
yeah,
Actually, it's a myth that he was frozen cryogenically.
really. Oh, I was kind of hoping his corpse would actually come back for it. But
Speaking of corpses coming back, let's get back to the argument. How would you address this positive rights bad thing, guys? I think that one kind of easy argument that you could make is that, and this is kind of an argument against the purity of negative rights as a concept, but just to make the argument that, hey, like most negative rights are kind of sort of positive rights too, almost by extension.
Yeah.
Because basically all negative rights require some positive right in terms of enforcement. Like, for example, the right to life. You could argue that there are things that people need to go out and do for you in order for you to really have the right to life. And whenever a government takes an action, let's say like the right to the right to like the right to your property, right? It's true that you have a right to have people not come over and steal from you. But in that sense, it also kind of restricts your positive right to do something to somebody else. So there's always kind of like rights trade-offs. And I think that there's a lot of positive versus negative switchbacks that go on. Lawrence, could you think you can maybe elaborate a little more on this?
Yeah, and I think another common example is that like most negative rights are kind of useless without positive right enforcement, as you're talking about. And I think an easy example is just sort of the existence of a government as a whole. You have to pay tax money to it, so it can provide things that are, it's positively obligated to provide things to protect you. So like a police force and a fire department, which require other agents to go out and do things on your behalf to protect your negative rights. So I think the sort of distinction between negative and positive rights gets especially blurry in the context of governmental obligations and proactive things the government has to do to protect your negative rights.
Kathy, what do you think about like maybe other arguments against this positive rights bad focus? Maybe in the context of the resolution, like how do people answer this argument at Kant, for example?
I heard an answer that was also sort of in the same vein as the ones you guys were talking about, but that basically went along the lines of it is uncertain how exactly to enforce a negative right, given that there's a humongous scope of things that could be done that aren't necessarily just giving housing, right? And so having the positive right delineates exactly what needs to be done and is therefore a better guide to action to follow than a negative right would be in that scenario.
Interesting. Although I think that this will be a very common negative argument, I think that there are a lot of affirmative resources to answer it. Lawrence, can you think of maybe any more?
Yeah, so beyond the sort of just like generic, good, bad, positive rights, good, bad sort of thing, I think one sort of extension of this is just sort of like a straightforward defense of positive rights being good. And the most common argument used to defend this is more of a Rawlsian type argument, which again, we'll talk about in a later argument clinic podcast, is that most of these negative rights make no sense without additional positive rights to enforce them or to make them like useful or valuable. So take, for example, the negative right to life. Well, if all that was required is that people do nothing to you, the most that you could possibly get is that you get to sit in a field by yourself and no one would come and talk to you. It seems like without, for example, the right to food or the right to shelter or the right to healthcare or the right to the ability to like stay alive, then that right seems like pretty difficult to make any real sense. Because, for example, if all you do is live in complete poverty, you don't talk to anyone, you're like sick all the time, and you don't have a place to stay, no one would really think that's like what the right to life really means. And so just defending that positive rights are good as necessary for negative rights to exist, then I think that's another way to tackle this argument head on.
Attack this argument head on, yes. Head on. Does head on mean like you attack the head of the argument, or do you like charge with your head into the argument?
I prefer to charge with my head into the other person's head and give us both concussions.
Ah, classic. So you are of the RAM argumentation school of thought.
Yes.
You just want to headbutt a bunch of people. Is that how you won most of your debates, Kathy?
I would like to say I was part of the RAM school of thought, but not necessarily into the other person's head. That sounds a little painful. Prefer maybe like just a solid, like, yeah, not maybe the nose, just maybe right in the gut, the usual.
Ramming your head to the nose. Well,
well,
you're getting,
there's
you're getting
a little
quality
bit of
debate strategic advice on this podcast. So, don't use the Lawrence school of thought where you give yourself a concussion. Just instead break their nose by just charging. Okay, so the second negative argument is an argument that we've talked about sort of a bunch on the podcast already, kind of this ought equals can shindig. So, Kathy, can you go into what this argument is, kind of like how the argument might look if you were to put it together?
Sure. the argument would be similar to what we've been saying before, that it's just not particularly possible to give a right to housing. Especially when it comes into play with a lot of app arguments that will always seem to go along the lines of like, there are millions of people who are homeless. It would be very hard to like understand what exactly it means to give them like a right to housing. And so if that is the case, and if it's vague, then it might not necessarily be implementable. And so that's the negative argument there, is that if we cannot do it, or we don't know how to do it, or there's no feasible way to do it, then we shouldn't be holding ourselves to an obligation that we can't fulfill.
So when you say like we can't fulfill it, I kind of want to get a sense of exactly the scope that you have for assessing that we can't fulfill this argument. And by that I mean, when you say, like, is the burden on yourself as the negative to prove that it's literally physically impossible for it to happen, or is it something else?
I think that would be I think that either it can go one of two ways. First, that you do take on that burden and say that it's physically impossible. I don't think that would be a very difficult argument to make. It would just be an application of like the amount of resources we have to provide housing versus the amount of homeless people there are. For instance, if there are not like enough empty houses for us to put them in, what do we do? Can we build can we build millions of houses if we necessarily need to? And the answer to that might be no. The other way we can do it potentially is just saying that the app hasn't really proven that we can do this. And I think this is where a lot of arguments and a lot of questioning and cross-ex could help. And because I think that a lot of apps I heard, at least on this topic, seem to be very reliant on just saying that there is a right, but not necessarily giving us what that world would look like. And so I think it would be very easy to get a concession that like they haven't really proved in their case that this is something that can happen, which would open up a great pathway for this negative argument to take place.
Yeah, and I mean, like, it would be like absurdly hard to give everyone in the United States the right to a house, right? I mean, it's like the scope of that is actually just insane. It's just enormous, right? Like, I think maybe a lot of intuitive affirmative pushback here, which is that, hey, it is possible if we try hard enough. Maybe doesn't even consider the scope that a right to housing would really require. Lawrence, do you think that, do you just frankly, do you think it's even possible for the United States to guarantee that everyone has a right to housing?
Well, I personally have my doubts, but I think there are two ways specifically the affirmative can push back on this. So the first is that empty houses actually outnumber the homeless 6-1 in the United States. So there's about 3.5 million people in the US that are homeless. About 600 of them are like homeless on any given night. But there are 18.5 million vacant homes in the country, mostly as a result of just like people abandon them or they're repossessed by the bank and they don't have a new owner. For whatever reason, there are actually way more empty houses than people. So it seems like by the numbers, easy enough to house them. And the second way I think the affirmative can push back is on sort of the monetary scale. And it actually turns out that a lot of studies have concluded that housing the homeless actually saves money versus not housing them. And some people are like, wait, how is this possible? Literally, we're spending no money on them right now. How can we possibly save money by paying for their houses? And as it turns out, the average homeless person actually costs the United States a ton of money because they get arrested for crimes related to homelessness. So, for example, trespassing, loitering, public urination, public consumption of alcohol, all of those sort of things. And that costs a ton of money to send them to jail. And they, because in the United States, you're allowed emergency room visits, even though you can't pay for them. It actually costs taxpayers a lot of money to treat homeless people who go into the emergency room because they have nowhere else to stay. So they just go use the emergency room, even though they can't pay for it. So actually housing them is cheaper than our current way of treating them, which is just leaving them on the streets. But we actually end up paying tons more money that way. So both from a housing numbers and a monetary standpoint, it seems possible to house every homeless person in the United States.
There's another economic argument that I think the affirmative has access to here, which is that, which is kind of a long-term versus short-term thing, right? Surely people that have housing and are kind of in a stable situation with access to employment are far more likely to become, although I feel that this phrase is overused, productive members of society,
Yeah.
like people that can actually kind of like produce something for the benefit of other people in society and, you know, stimulate economic output. So one could even make the argument that it would kind of just be maybe some short-term loss for long-term gain.
Yeah.
Okay, so and then the very last negative argument that we'll talk about sort of briefly here, because it's very similar to the above argument, is that it's possible, although I'm not sure how likely it is, but it is possible that giving someone a right to housing can make things worse. I've read articles talking about the effects of right to housings in other countries, and that if you compare some of those countries to, for example, the United States actually does better than a lot of those countries in terms of housing, when that really makes no sense if your thought is that the right to housing is the greatest thing of all time. So there is a fair amount of evidence from those other countries that the right to housing and housing rights in general just doesn't work and could even have some negative effects. Throughout the course of looking at your research, Kathy, did you find any potential negative effects that could come about of generating a right to housing, or was it mostly just positive effects?
I actually have found some negative effects. While I was researching this topic, it seems that there is currently a humongous like civil rights case going on in Bulgaria that seems to have a right to housing in a certain article of their constitution or something like that. And so the current struggle there is that they're being put into court by some international thing because they're actually not necessarily keeping up with it, and in a way that seems very discriminatory, so that the right to housing is actually only selectively applied. The case in Bulgaria is specifically about the Roma people who are not necessarily getting the houses that they should be guaranteed. And so there are a lot of arguments against them and the nation as a whole just saying that, like, hey, you promise these rights, but you're not giving them. It sounds pretty like discriminatory of you, and that's not really cool.
Not really cool. Lack of coolness is the value criterion that you should be using, ladies and gents. No coolness whatsoever. So Lawrence, have you found any sort of similar negative effects or a way that applying a right to housing could make things even worse?
So there aren't many, and I think Kathy hit on the big ones. But one example is actually in France, where in order to accommodate for the homelessness problem that France has, they have adopted a formal right to housing, and they're actually building a bunch of houses in order to compensate for the amount of homeless that exist. But this policy solution actually ended up having a few negative side effects. So for one thing, it ended up actually building a bunch of houses that weren't needed because people would occupy them and then leave, and they would never be used for something more. But technically, the number of homeless was still, really high. So they build more houses, and that policy was implemented so poorly that it actually resulted in hundreds of thousands of houses being built for virtually no reason, and it actually wasted a ton of money, a ton of effort, and actually got people kind of like angry a little bit about all of the unnecessary houses that were being built. So it seems like some policy solutions might, in fact, not work at all and might make things a little bit worse. And another argument that I sort of saw being made at camp was that these solutions don't actually really work because the housing market is like just simply giving people houses doesn't really solve a lot of the root causes of why people are homeless. So, for example, they don't have jobs, or they have mental illnesses, or they are just like kicked out by like a greedy bank or whatever. And giving people a house doesn't really like solve the problem of housing. And even though they are given a house, they can't really stay in it because they can't pay for it, or they're evicted, or whatever. And so just giving people houses doesn't solve a lot of the problems that cause homelessness in the first place.
Those are some pretty good arguments in favor of this. Now, I am not quite as deep in the literature, and I haven't really seen any debates on this at all because I wasn't at camp on this topic. So, Kathy and Lawrence, I guess, based on both of your experience, what are some of the ways that the affirmatives have fought back against these objections?
Well, I didn't really hear this argument at camp. I think it's actually pretty recent. I came up with it while researching a little earlier, but it seems that a very simple way is just counterexamples in Wang. For instance, there is a article on the Washington Post that was published relatively recently about how Utah just decided to give houses to homeless, and then they ended up like not only like solving homelessness, their chronic homelessness is at like nearly 0%, but also saving a lot of money. So it's very similar to a bunch of arguments that are just like, hey, it's getting better on the F, that you can just pretty much cross apply against these kind of arguments as long as you do the good weighing example. For instance, like Utah is in the United States. It's probably a much better representative than Bulgaria, which is like hundreds of miles away.
Bulgaria is 100 miles away. That's 100% accurate. Yeah, I think making the argument that Bulgaria is not the United States will definitely benefit you in debate rounds. That they are physically separate places and also meaningfully different in terms of the way that rights work and stuff. So
could have fooled me.
Get this girl a map. So, Lawrence, do you think that this debate favors the negative or the affirmative? You've mentioned some examples of places where things have gotten worse, but obviously there's a lot of potential for things to get better. How do you think that the statistics go, and do you think that they would be borne out in the United States as proving that we should have a right to housing or we should not?
It's hard to say, especially since it's never really been implemented in such a large scale like the United States. And I think that despite a lot of the affirmative, like arguments in favor of a right to housing, that for some logistical reason or another, that it's just probably not going to solve all of homelessness. There's probably going to be some ways that any given policy that is adopted will just backfire or result in more problems, or will just simply fail to fix the problem of homelessness. And so I think to some degree, the negative just has an advantage because it's just so difficult for the affirmative to, solve homelessness and to guarantee everyone a right to housing, despite all of the strong arguments in the affirmative's favor.
Now, if you were the affirmative trying to militate against this argument with your military, how would you? What are some troops that you would recommend, Lawrence, to assign to the charge? And by that I mean, what arguments do you think that the affirmative should make against something like this?
Well, so I think as Kathy mentioned earlier, just sort of giving examples and comparing them to the examples the negative is giving, as well as maybe even being like a little bit specific in some of the examples that you provide for how we would provide a right to housing. So like in cross-examination, when the negative asks, how would you do this? Having a good answer, like here are a couple of ways that we could do this, and these are considered to be effective ways at addressing homelessness, might be a way for the affirmative to get out of a lot of things. Because when judges hear these examples and you can provide sort of reasonable, logical explanations for why these examples are effective at solving homelessness, then I think that helps the affirmative against these negative objections about it failing.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that sort of general approach. All right, well, those are the three negative arguments, and we'll be right back with the conclusion. All right, well, that's the show for this week. I'd like to specially thank our guest, Kathy Wang. She's been absolutely great, and we're so happy to have her on the podcast. Thanks for coming on, Kathy.
Yeah, no problem. It was super fun.
I do agree that it was super fun. You're super fun, This is just you're
super fun.
A super fun time. No, Lawrence is super fun.
Well, we can settle this when we hang out for multiple weeks at camp this summer.
Ooh, that is a good point. So,
see us there.
All right. So now on to the most important segment of the podcast, the mini debate. Okay, so I am going to select the topic of best pizza. And by best pizza, I mean best place that you have pizza. And you can get in on this debate too if you want, Kathy. But
I'm from New York. You guys are going to get creamed.
I actually think that this is a crush, but I'm gonna sandbag my answer because you will absolutely not expect it. So I'm gonna let you go first, Kathy. What's the best pizza you've ever had?
Joe's Pizza in downtown Manhattan. It is the pizza that you walk in and you just see like photos everywhere of celebrities going in. It is the New York pizza. I like ate a slice underneath the photo of Danny DeVito holding one. It was pretty incredible. It was also featured in Spider-Man.
That's fair. All right, all right, all
It's
right.
also 2
Lawrence.
blocks from my dorm, so that's very nice.
Whoa there. That seems very unfair. So you have a shake machine in your dorm and pizza outside your dorm?
Yeah, that's what happens when you live in a big city.
That's just so
Yeah,
unfair.
that's not fair.
That's so unfair. All right, Lawrence, best pizza. Let's go.
Crap, I usually just eat like Papa John's, so it's kind of hard for me to make a judgment here. But I'm gonna go with the pizza I had this weekend at the Cal tournament from Pyology. I don't think it was great in any particular sense that like it tasted amazing and blew my mind away. But I like the ability to customize the pizza because you can just like order whatever you want onto it, and it's like they have every possible topping available. So I just had like every available type of meat, like all like 10 of them stacked onto this pizza, and it was pretty good. I'm probably gonna lose this debate, but
Well,
yeah,
That doesn't sound like a pizza anymore.
I can't
Well,
I can't
you
compete
also-
with authentic New York
you
pizza.
also you also just admitted prior to giving your answer that it wasn't even good. You were just like, I'm not going to claim that the pizza that I ate was actually good tasting
it
or
was.
anything, comma. And
But
then,
the
you
problem
said
is
some
that
stuff.
I'm up against a sandbag answer, which is supposedly so great it can beat New York pizza and actual New York pizza, which is like unbeatable.
Also, just the fact that like pizza at debate tournaments is always just a sad, desperate last ditch thing to get in before the next round.
No, Pyology is different. It's different than that Papa John's pizza that they bring to your debate round.
So
No, but to
this
be
is
fair,
not my
Harvard-
answer. This is not my answer, but have either of you ever eaten a mellow mushroom before?
No.
No, what is that?
Really? You haven't? I don't.
Nope.
Maybe it's like mostly in the South. Mellow Mushroom is just this like very kind of like hippie place with tons of different types of really cool pizzas that you can get, and I just go there to debate tournaments a bunch of times.
What debate tournaments are near Mellow Pizza?
Well, most of the time. Well, so I had some at Emory this past year, as in this past month. I don't know why I said year. But I also, when I used to go to college debate tournaments around the South, like at like Vanderbilt or whatever, we would always get some mellow mushrooms because we already had a bunch of vegan people on the team and like vegetarian people, and it was very vegetarian vegan friendly. All right, so to give my answer, I'm going to give you each 5 guesses. So it's from outside the United States, and I'm going to give you guys.
Man.
I'm going to give you guys 5 guesses of what country it was in. And
Well, if you're giving us 5,
actually,
I'm assuming it's not.
I'm going to give you 7 guesses.
What?
Each. Yeah.
That's like 14 countries. We got this.
Well, yeah. So I will let you trade off. So let's start with Lawrence and see if you can guess it.
All right, Zimbabwe.
Do we get continent hits?
No. No continent hits. It was not Zimbabwe.
Canada?
Nope.
South Africa.
Nope.
Hmm.
Never been to
France.
South Africa. Nope, not France.
Liechtenstein.
Is that a country?
Yes.
Yes.
Well,
Very small.
No.
Japan.
Nope. Never been to Japan, unfortunately.
Azerbaijan.
Nope.
Are you even trying, Lawrence?
How dare you?
Wait, what? Which
You have 4 guesses
which
left.
guess are we on now? 4 left.
You have 4 left. Lawrence has 3 left.
Oh, right, 7. Oh boy. Mexico?
Micronesia.
Nope.
Brazil?
Nope.
Kosovo.
Nope.
Why did you get quiet?
Well, Lawrence submitted an answer, and so he was incorrect. So I'm waiting for you.
Oh, so both Brazil and Kosovo were incorrect.
That's right.
Okay, what number are we on?
You have 2 left.
I have 2 left. Got you. Let's see. Sweden.
Nope. One guess left. Make it count.
Djibouti.
Nope.
Got him.
I'll give you a hint because it's the last guess. It is technically in Europe. I believe that this country is in Europe. It is a small country.
A small country that's technically in Europe?
It is a small country in Europe.
Wait, is it in Europe or not? I think this is an important part.
I'm pretty sure it's in Europe.
You're pretty sure? So it's Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Okay. Lithuania.
No, it was Slovenia.
Oh, close.
The best pizza I've ever had, and I had it multiple times, is in
How many times did you go to Slovenia?
in Ljubljana, which has a bunch of J's in it, in case you didn't know. But the pizza that I had was just absolutely insane. It was funny because we then went to Italy after that, and the pizza was worse.
I was in Italy recently to study abroad, and the pizza there is actually terrifying. I didn't realize they don't do it by the slice. They just give you the entire pie and a knife and tell you to go at it. And I was
That's
just
true.
not prepared for that.
Yeah, it's usually like fine. I thought it was pretty overrated, but the pizza that I got in the capital of Slovenia and Ljubljana was just actually just insane. It was so good. It's the best pizza I've ever had. And I've had New
I think
York
we need
pizza.
a little more explanation. What was on that pizza?
It was just like a very normal, average pizza in terms of like what it had. It was like a margarita pizza-ish.
So what made it so special?
The crust was just nuts. It was like
nuts?
it was
Like
just like
almonds?
it was. Yeah, it was made of almonds. No, it was just like a bananas combination of like sauce, cheese, and crust that just made it insane. I'm just getting hungry now.
So there are bananas on it? Nuts and bananas?
Nuts and banana. Anything goes in Slovenia. It was great. All right, so I'm not sure if anyone really won there, but I know Lawrence lost. I'm not sure. I'm going to submit that Slovenian pizza is great, but obviously, no one can verify that. Because I'm sure that most of our listeners have not had Slovenian pizza. And if you had, completely send me an email at theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com so that I know who you are, so that we can have a little chat.
Lawrence might have a point. Djibouti pizza could be okay.
Djibouti pizza. I'm not sure that Lawrence was saying that he thought Djibouti pizza was good.
No, I just thought the name was funny.
No, yeah. Well, it is.
He at least implied
That's
that you
correct.
ate pizza in Djibouti.
Well, see, Lawrence actually had the best approach, which was, given the context of my question, to just name just random countries. And however, he named a bunch of like African and like continental, like Asian countries that I haven't been to. So,
Is that Liechtenstein? That's a small country in Europe, isn't it?
yeah, but I clearly didn't
It's
know
true.
that it was a country at all. So, if you had said Luxembourg, that would have been like pretty close. Very,
That's
very
too
similar.
mainstream.
Luxembourg is too mainstream. What are you saying?
I googled the most obscure countries and just read off a list.
you just Googled obscure countries. That is like a pretty good way of responding to a Martin question. Just like, what is
That's
something
fair.
really obscure? Okay, so indeterminate win between Martin and Kathy on that
Definitive
point.
loss.
Big L from Lawrence.
Big L.
Okay, so thank you for hanging out with us this week. Remember to like our Facebook page if you like our content. Send us an email if you just want to talk to us. Leave a comment on SoundCloud. We've had some comments on SoundCloud as well. Get us on iTunes. Get us on Stitcher. Follow us on Twitter, et cetera. And remember that VBI is a great camp and a great place. So. From Kathy Wang, from Lawrence Zhou, and from myself, we all encourage you to stay frosty.
this isn't an argument.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't. It's just contradiction.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It is not.